Hey guys, today we are in chapter 6 of Acts. We pick up with it says that the church is increasing in number. So even though the apostles have been arrested, they've been beaten, they've been told not to preach, persecution is still making the church grow. So they're increasing in numbers. But then we can see a problem. It says a complaint by the Hellenists rose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in daily distribution. Now, what's going on here, right? So as we've read through Acts, we've seen several acts of Satan trying to destroy the church, right? The apostles have been arrested. They have been told not to preach. They've been beaten. We've seen lots of things going on with Satan kind of working in the background. But now we see kind of the worst part of Satan. And it's still the part that really goes on today in that the church starts to divide itself, that there are groups of people, of Christians, complaining against other Christians, okay? And we have two groups. We have one that's called the Hellenists and the Hebrews. The Hebrews are simply the Jews, okay, the Jewish Christians. The Hellenists could be, and probably were, still Jews, but they were the ones who were dispersed, who did not live in Jerusalem, and they lived in Gentile countries. Hundreds of years before this time, there was a guy named Alexander the Great. You've probably heard of him just from normal world history. Alexander the Great was a young king, and his goal was to make the world his own. And he did that. And the biggest way that he did that was not just conquering everywhere like the Babylonians did, like the Assyrians did, like the Persians did, but he fostered this idea that he's going to conquer everywhere, but he's also going to make them speak in the Greek language. And so when he took over and he made Greek basically the world language, and so they had a world language, they had a world education, they had a world monetary value, everything revolved around what Alexander the Great wanted, this Grecian culture. This Grecian culture is called the Hellenistic period. And that's not a Bible term, that's just a history term. And so basically, he conquers the world and he makes everybody in the world at least able to speak and to know and to act in the Grecian culture. So now, hundreds of years later, when the Jews come, when the Jews are leaving Israel because of some periods in the hundreds, 200s, even from Babylon, when they are taken in Babylon, they don't come back to Israel. They go to other nations, but all these other nations were taken over, and what happened? They learned Grecian, and so now they kind of have these Jews who are Jewish, but they have been raised in a culture of Grecian culture and Greek culture. And so what happens, they kind of marry the two. So you have two sets of Jews who believe in Jesus. One who is very, we would say, conservative. We would call them kind of today like holy rollers, the ones who were diehard to the Mosaic law and to the rabbi Hebrew culture. Then you have the other ones who grew up everywhere else in the world outside of Israel, who are Jewish, but they're also kind of Grecian and kind of all these other countries that have kind of taken over. So there's kind of this melting pot. Now that the church is starting to grow, now remember, all the Jews were coming in for Pentecost, right? They've been saved, they've heard the gospel, and now they're hearing the gospel, but now time is moving on, and so a lot of these Jews are going home. Some of them stayed home in Israel, but others are going back to Turkey and to India and to Syria and to all of these countries that are around, right? So the church is now spreading from these Jews who either have a Hebrew background or a Greek background, right? So that's it. So the complaint comes, okay, all that to say this, right? So this complaint comes, and it says that the Hellenist Jews, these Jews who have this Grecian background, their widows were not being taken care of like the Jews, the believers, the Jewish believers that had the Hebrew background. Now, probably, we don't know for sure, but probably this is not a thing that happened on purpose. This is not like the Hebrew Jewish believers were just being mean and overlooking. This probably comes from the idea that, remember, Israel, the religious elite in Israel, has told these apostles to stop preaching, okay? They've continued to preach, right? So now they control the food and the money that's going out to all of the Jewish widows. And so what's happening now, they're kind of shutting down the system. They're kind of shutting down the welfare system of the widows of the believers who are outside of Israel, because the apostles are keeping on teaching about Jesus, right? So they can't stop these apostles from preaching, but they can stop their humanitarian needs to the people that they're preaching to, right? So trying to put pressure on the apostles to stop, right? So instead of putting pressure on the apostles to stop, the apostles say, this is something the church can do. We need to do this. We need to take this on, right? So they call the church together, right? So the 12 apostles call the church together and they say, we've got a problem. We can stop preaching. We can stop teaching. We can stop evangelizing. We can stop growing the church, and we can feed and make sure that the widows get the things that they need to live. Or we can continue what Jesus has called us to do, and the church full of people, you guys can come along and help serve in this ministry to make sure this happens. And they said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to keep teaching and preaching as apostles, and the church is going to make sure that the widows are taken care of, right? So they say, pick out 7 men of good repute, full of spirit and wisdom, and we will appoint to this duty. Now, we don't know why 7. It could be that 7 men, one of each day, and that man would oversee let's say Stephen had Monday. On Monday, he would oversee that people under him would make sure that they would get the food to the widows or the money or the needs that the widows have. And then on Tuesday, it would be another guy. We don't know that for sure, but we know that the church is well over 10,000 at this time. It would have been a lot of widows, just simply would have been. So really there would have been more to do than just 7 men could have done. So it's kind of 7 leaders, and they would have probably had people under them helping and working in that, right? So they're going to pick out 7 men, good reputation. They're going to be saved, full of spirit and wisdom, point to this duty. And the apostles say, and we're going to keep to praying and the ministry of the word and preaching and evangelism, right? So you guys do this, we'll do this. Notice this, verse 5. Remember the church, there was an issue, right? There's a complaint. You kind of had 2 parties against one another. Verse 5, what happens? They were pleased. They were pleased. The whole gathering, the whole church come together, and they were pleased, right? So the apostles kept doing what God wanted them to do. The people stepped up and served and met the needs, and everybody was happy with that. And that's what we should do today. When there comes a complaint in the church, we resolve the issue with godly standards, and then we should be happy. We shouldn't hold on to it. We shouldn't be like, well, they just try to do this and they try to do that, and they knew what they were doing. They were just leaving out the Hellenistic widows. No, solve the problem, love Jesus, and move on, right? And so we get a list of the 7 men they chose. But for the next couple chapters, notice the very first one, Stephen, and notice what it says, a man full of faith and Holy Spirit, right? And so they did this. And what happened? Not only was the church pleased, but that it continued to increase in size. And now we see that even priests, workers in the temple, these Jewish Hebrews, these ultimate Jewish Hebrews, they were starting to come to faith, right? And so now we see that Stephen, this guy who we saw in verse 5, was a man full of faith in the Spirit. Verse 8 says he was full of grace and power. He was doing great wonders and signs, right? Wonders and signs were proving the gospel. That's what they were doing, as he was serving his widows and doing his ministry. And what happens? And some of those who belong to the synagogue, so non-believers, right? They were mad at him, just like they were with Peter and John, just like they were with Jesus. But notice what happens. They got in a dispute with him. And once again, we've seen time and time again what happens. That verse 10, they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which they were speaking. Stephen opened himself up to let the Spirit speak for him, and man could not quench what the words that the Spirit was doing, right? Just like Jesus, just like Peter, just like John. These people truly believe that when we're persecuted for Jesus, they believe that Jesus told them, I will give you the words to say, and when I give you these words, the world will not be able to quench these words, right? And exactly what happened. And so what happens? Just like Jesus, just like Peter, just like John, they instigated men. They caused some Jewish men to come up and to lie against him and said that he's speaking blasphemy against the Moses. They stirred up the people, the crowds, the elders, the scribes. They said that this man ceases to speak words against the holy place, basically saying he's teaching against the temple and the law and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. For they're saying that he is saying that Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place, right? Jesus of Nazareth is dead in their eyes, right? He's been resurrected. And so he's preaching the news, but they're saying all these things, right? All these things and taking them out of context and saying that he is lying against Israel. In verse 15, and gazing at him, all who sat in the council saw his face was like the face of an angel. So they're lying, they're cultivating this thing against Stephen, and Stephen, just like when he debated in the synagogue of the freedmen, these people, what happens? It says he had the face of an angel. Now, what does that mean? The face of an angel means that he had peace. He had confidence. He had trust. He did not have fear. He did not have terror. Much like the apostles who just went before the thing and they were beat. And it says they walked out rejoicing, right? He knows his Jesus. He knows the Holy Spirit is in him. The Holy Spirit is giving him the words and the wisdom to do. And he is totally at peace with that. Even though he's being persecuted, he is at peace with the gospel and the words that Jesus is giving him. And so that's going to lead us in, right? This powder keg keeps kind of gaining and gaining and gaining. And we will see what happens on Monday in chapter 7. But I hope this makes a little bit more sense for chapter 6, and we will see you Monday for chapter 7. God bless.